Hello and welcome to the Global Summit on Technology Facilitated Gender-Based Violence. Today's panel is titled Addressing Misogyny, Ensuring Men and Boys are Part of the Discussion. My name is Francesca Gentile and I'm a researcher at the Centre for Information Resilience, or CIR in short, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this conversation today. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some general housekeeping. The contents of this session may be triggering for some. If you'd like to reach out for support, you'll find a link in the lobby chat to the No More Global Directory, a global directory of specialist domestic abuse and sexual violence services. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy today's session. Misogyny is a key driver of abuse and hostility towards a woman, both online and offline. Certain harmful gender norms around masculinity, such as dominance, entitlement, and emotional suppression, can fuel misogynistic attitudes and behaviours. Meaningful progress, therefore, depends on engaging men and boys directly, supporting them to question these norms, understanding the harms impacting them, and empowering them to help create safer and more inclusive communities for everyone. One reason this conversation feels particularly urgent right now is that men and boys have increasingly become part of public conversations around online harms and misogyny, especially through recent documentaries and TV shows. Joining me today are two brilliant speakers, Mark Brooks and Caroline Hayes. Mark is the Policy Director for the Centre for Policy Research on Men and Boys. He is a sector leader and advisor in the fields of men and boys' public policy, communications, and delivery. He was awarded an OBE and an honorary doctorate in recognition of his work in this field. Caroline is the Senior Technical Specialist on Digital Strategies at Equimundo. She provides technical expertise and programmatic leadership across Equimundo's digital strategies and innovation portfolio, focusing on addressing harmful masculinities online, promoting healthy digital engagement, and strengthening positive narratives for men and boys. Thank you both so much for joining us today. In this session, we will examine why including men and boys in the conversation is essential to tackling online misogyny and how this can be done effectively. Both of our speakers have been working on these issues for a long time, and I'm excited to hear not only what they are seeing, but also what's actually working or the changes to tackle these issues. To start us off, I want to ground us in the current landscape. From your experience, what problems are men and boys facing that may lead them towards misogynistic voices or ideologies online? And how is this issue taking hold in online spaces? Mark, let me start with you first.
That's a great question, and it's a really welcome question, because I think a few years ago we would be just looking at the situation from men and boys causing problems because they're men and boys. Men and boys cause problems. But actually, where the debate has moved on, and the TV shows and the documentaries that you've mentioned actually pose a serious question for a lot of us, in that they were showcasing the outcomes, but they weren't going upstream and looking at what the causes were. And I think that all of us in this kind of men and boys in the gender equality world have actually realised that just looking at the outcomes is not going to fix the problem, because we're not looking at the causes. And so, but that's quite new. That's only really about last year that actually the penny is dropped, for so many to actually look at these issues, and also trying to think about, and some of the work that we're going to be doing is like looking at what type of boys, because it's not all boys and it's not all young men. So are there some particular type of boys, young men, in terms of their background, in terms of their the family composition, all of those issues, to actually start to go upstream and looking at what type of communities they're in, whether there's jobs, whether they're getting well educated, whether they're lonely, disconnected. So we're going upstream, and that's where the debate has to start, and the policy work has to start.
Thank you, Mark. And Caroline, do you see similar patterns in your work?
Yeah, I think just to sort of ground the conversation, I think it's helpful to think about the concept of how we understand masculinities or the norms that shape what it means to be a man itself. I think a lot of what we're seeing in online spaces are sort of informed and reflect how multiple institutions, bodies, and society sort of shape these ideas around what it means to be a man. And I really like what Mark said about looking upstream. So not just looking at sort of the outcomes or the harm that happens that we're seeing that many institutions have been measuring and seeing upticks in harm online for years. But also, as Mark said, looking upstream, like what are the facets of society that shape certain types of behavior and how do social norms play into that? And one of the ways that we look at that is through at Equimundo, the organization I work at, is through a scale that we call the man box scale, or sort of restrictive ideas of what it means to be a man that make men and boys feel like there's only one way to behave, or there's only a narrow path that you have to walk in order to get power or status in society. And so some of those things are norms like dominance or hyper self-sufficiency, extreme aggression, things like this. Things that obviously not all men and boys adhere to, but are certainly promoted in some spaces online and on the internet, and certainly can reward boys and young men for toughness or emotional suppression, but also punish them for things like vulnerability and cooperation, things like this. So it's a multifaceted conversation, I think, that sometimes loses its nuance when we only look at men and boys as perpetrators and not as sort of holistic actors in a broader system, not only as, potential perpetrators, but also as those designing and controlling digital platforms, also as bystanders, consumers of content, and in many cases, secondary victims of the same online cultures that sort of foster a lot of hostility and alienation. So, yeah, I think, going into, as we step into this conversation, I think it's helpful to look at the conversation around men and boys and masculinities in general as a very nuanced and multifaceted conversation that I'm glad to have some time to dig into. But to the question around sort of what problems we're seeing, and also to address some of the issues that Mark was saying, I think one thing I really want to hone in on is this the issue around economic insecurity. We're seeing this as such a deeply tied issue to a lot of the sort of behavior or conversations playing out online. There's a lot of intense pressure, specifically in our US data at Equimundo, for young men to feel intense pressure to fulfill this sort of traditional provider role. In our research, 86% of men said that being a provider is the most important trait of manhood. And notably, 77% of women also reinforced or also said that that was the highest trait that men should have as well. So these are expectations that are coming that men are clearly adhering to in our data, but also potential partners, women, people of diverse gender identities also hold these same expectations or understandings of what men should be. And so at the same time, we're seeing a lot of young men coming of age and amid stagnant wages, precarious employment, skyrocketing costs of living. And of course, that is the case for people of all gender identities, but there's a real widening gap between sort of social expectations of manhood and many men's economic realities that I think that gap really seeds fertile ground for a lot of resentment and scapegoating or even exploitation by some of the actors you might have seen in the film, Inside the Manosphere, the Louis Theroux documentary. And so, yeah, I think it's just really interesting for us to look at like what expectation versus reality really is in a lot of young people's lives, and how we can actually respond to those unmet needs upstream before sort of exploitative actors might seize that ground. And so, yeah, just really looking forward to digging into the conversation further beyond that.
I guess my next follow-up question, I'll bring it back to you, Mark, if there's anything you'd like to add, especially on the expectations versus reality, the sort of harms that men and boys might be facing online, the narratives that they are exposed to, and the sense of needing to face up to those expectations.
Well, exactly, and that economic security insecurity is a key driver, and of course, we've got the algorithms which are pushing either content to them, either from toxic influencers, but also we there's been some really good research coming out actually from America as well with regard to actually bad state actors actually pushing this content deliberately to men and boys because pushing this content which is harmful to women and girls because they want to undermine democratic institutions and so forth. So again, the conversation is really maturing at a rapid space where it's quite binary a few years ago and it's rapid now. In addition, we've got a better handle on the different typology and taxonomy, if you like, of the full range of harms which are affecting men and boys, which of course then have that pernicious knock-on effect, misogyny and sexism as well, and racism and other issues, which we didn't really have a handle on before, and some of that, for example, around crypto, gambling, pornography. Um, Body image issues, of course, as well as obviously the economic insecurity issues, the lack of male mentors. And part of the some of the problems we've seen is that a lot of young men and boys don't have a pathway and either an emotional pathway or guidance from any male mentors. That could be dads, stepdads, or just men in the community, like male teachers, for example. So we're not providing guardrails for a lot of these young men and boys, and therefore those toxic influences and others are stepping into that space, which has obviously been a real concern. And just there was a report quite recently in the UK from the anti-slavery commissioner, for example. We have one in the UK, and her report was looking at uh, online harms and saying that some elements of gaming community and online community were pushing boys three or four conversations down the line into joining county lines or basically being drug mules within their communities. Now, I never heard of that before. And also part of that community was dragging young women into those environments as well. So the conversation is broadening, and we've got a better handle now on the online harms which affect men and boys, which then have that pernicious knock-on effect.
Going back to, you mentioned bad actors. Caroline, is that something that, with the research that you've done, is that something that you've also noticed? Have you been able to sort of identify, separate the influencers and, understanding who it is that's actually creating that content that can affect men and boys or is sort of directed at men and boys? Is that something that you've looked into as well?
Yeah, I appreciate the nod to like the idea of male role models not necessarily being there, male teachers, etc. I think what came through in our analysis, we actually a lot of the other organizations that we partner with, maybe 4 or so years ago, were looking at sort of more of the fringe spaces on the internet when they were looking at sort of the bad actors, take 4chan or incels.is, some of these sort of more dark web spaces. Because we're a primary prevention organization, we were actually looking sort of, again, upstream, looking at more mainstream content that young men and boys were looking for information on. So like what, just asking innocuous questions like how to get a date, how to get fit, how to make a good protein smoothie, things like that, things that are like completely harmless and, any questions any young person might have, right? And to sort of coupled with this idea of this lack of like in-person third spaces and role models, we analyzed sort of hundreds of hours of content and more than 1 million lines of data in TikTok, Discord, Reddit, YouTube, Twitch, fantasy football leagues. and found that a lot of the answers to those questions around like how to get a date, how to get fit, things that a young man might have asked a teacher or something like that, a coach or something. Previously, a lot of the content that was coming into the feeds when in our content analysis were really like guidance, belonging, and identity formation around four key topics, which were, again, romance and dating, fitness and health, finance and wealth, and mental health and self-improvement. Again, legitimate curiosities. But what we found in the content analysis on a lot of these kind of mainstream platforms were sort of a large slew of sentiment and narrative analysis that really sort of constructed a compelling story that framed contemporary social changes as a direct threat to the status and identity of a lot of young men, sort of using emotionally charged language and imagery designed to kind of provoke a sense of fear, anger, or a sense of urgency. And, you know, a lot of times leveraging young men's insecurity, but also offering very clear guidelines or tools for success, like norms and visual cues that men can understand that would sort of let them know what's expected of them and how to achieve that in sort of a step-by-step way. But what we also found in our data was sort of how sort of the content that was the most emotionally charged or most sort of like provoking of fear and resentment were the ones that got like the most views and eyeballs on screens for the longest amount of time. And so what we started looking into was sort of how platform business models often reward emotionally charged or polarizing content because outrage really drives engagement, and content that frames gender equality or sort of nuanced conversations around masculinities or identity didn't perform as well as sort of the content that framed gender equality as a threat or women as adversaries. And so this content really performs well economically, both for the creators of that and the platforms themselves. And so it's this mutually reinforcing dynamic that we have going on that doesn't serve young men at all, as well as the women, gender diverse people, you know, society, democracy, things that Mark was talking about, et cetera. And so, yeah, I think what we're trying to really think about is unless we address sort of root causes and really understand sort of the ecosystems that people are growing up in, the digital ecosystems, we'll continue to see sort of powerful gateways into more extreme misogyny and tech facilitated gender-based violence. And we'll continue to see Francesca, as you were saying, like sort of bad actors, which I don't prefer to name them here and give them more fuel to the fire, right? Taking advantage of some of these sort of profit models and platform incentive structures.
Well, there's so much to unpack and so many questions that I have as follow-up. But I guess, Mark, I'll bring it back to you before we move on to the solutions. If there's anything more you want to add in terms of like even the radicalization process, which I know it's not something that you can have a step-by-step sort of guide, and it's something that differs between people and people out there. But I wonder if there's, I don't know, something you can talk about in terms of men and boys being exposed, not just to the ecosystems online, if it's a mixture of both the online ecosystem, the online narratives, the online harms, and then also the background, the offline community they may have. Is it a mixture of both? Is it online and offline, or is it just online?
I think it's primarily um, online, and certainly try not to get into the solutions right now, but I mean, there's an issue about trying to get young men and boys offline and outside. I mean, it's something we've been looking at about getting young men and boys from being inside to outside, because if you're outside, and whether that's in community groups, you know, whether that's in scouting, civic institutions, sports clubs, what have you, actually they act as guardrails. B, they give that sense of connection that so many young men and boys wouldn't. They also have this sense of being part of a team, a sense of belonging, There's a lot of self-policing. Young men and boys self-police each other as well. So part of the problem is often been is that they're just spending too much time on online. And a good example, if you look at some of the historical examples, is that what we're seeing is young male unemployment going up. Now, maybe different in other parts of the world, but 20 years ago, when you had a group of young men who were unemployed, there would be riots and there would be just big and wider social issues. What we're finding now is that we're hitting similar levels of young male unemployment, but we're not seeing that outside expression, i.e., riots, for example. But what we're seeing is that actually that being internalized and actually them being online and expressing their frustration and being obviously picked on, as Caroline said that they're being exploited, but it's going on behind in their bedrooms or within certain online groups rather than being seen outside, which it was 20 years ago.
Wow. Thank you both for going through all of the problems, I'd say. So what I'm hearing is that the conversation is shifting from seeing men and boys only as perpetrators to recognizing them as potential agents of change. Addressing harms requires looking upstream at drivers shaping masculinity, so including economic insecurity and pressures to conform to certain realities. Toxic online spaces are filling gaps left by the lack of positive male mentors and role models. We've got polarizing and harmful content that's often being rewarded by platforms, incentives, and reinforcing those damaging narratives. And then there's just this sort of need not only to look at the outputs, but it's also a need to look at the root causes, what's actually happening. It's really fascinating because it's kind of similar to the findings, what you've mentioned. It's very similar to the findings that we've seen at CIR in different contexts. And in our work at CIR from Ethiopia to the US, we've seen how rigid expectations around masculinity can shape online abuse. And so men are often attacked with slurs and insults for not conforming to traditional expectations of strength and dominance, which is what you both have mentioned. And then during the 2024 US elections, we noticed that both male and female candidates were targeted with very similar levels of TFGBV and judged against very rigid gender norms. So, for example, masculinity was presented as a prerequisite for leadership, and any deviation from traditional masculine leadership qualities was often considered politically disqualifying. And what's interesting as well is that both men and women candidates were presented as not manly enough for leadership positions. This sort of shifts us to the solutions. And I guess my question for both of you is, how can we effectively engage men and boys in tackling online misogyny? And what does good practice and measurable impact look like in these areas? Caroline, I'll start with you. You mentioned platforms. Is that something that's worth talking about?
Yeah, I mean it's always worth talking about. We'll see, how much we can cook up here in this session to move the platforms where we want them to go. But yeah, I really appreciate the comments you're making about sort of how looking at all of the political candidates, regardless of gender identity, there seemed to be this like masculine ideal that no one was able to measure up to, and these sort of moving goalposts that always seem to be shifting, no matter try as we might, we can never seem to adhere to this hyper masculine script that like it just sets everybody up for failure, right? And so I think it's really worth interrogating that. And it's become really clear in our work that rather than shaming or isolating young men out of in conversations around online misogyny, we bring them into that conversation around those moving goalposts and how shame and isolation work actually because they're also not able to measure up to these sort of like status markers that make people feel really bad about themselves and ultimately lead to social and community fracturing that's not good for anyone, including men themselves. So um, if we really want to, build solutions and meaningfully engage men and boys, we really have to understand sort of the very real needs and vulnerabilities that are drawing them into these spaces that are meeting them in the first place, and then actually build or bring them towards healthier alternatives that are actually compelling and fun and interesting. And so at Equimundo, we really see this as like a prevention challenge and as a design challenge. And so we know, as we've been talking about this whole time, there's a lot of young men going online looking for connection, identity, advice, belonging, these sorts of things. Right now, there's a lot of harmful actors that are doing a better job than public institutions at meeting those needs in those spaces that are really like capitalizing on the platform functionalities that we are seeing. They're fast, emotionally resonant, really community oriented, actually, and deeply embedded in digital culture. And so, the question that we're really asking ourselves when thinking about solutions is not just how do we remove harmful content? Oh no, there's harmful content out there. Let's play whack-a-mole and try and like ban it, right? Like that's one version and one lane of talking about solutions. But the question we're really grappling with is actually how do we create more caring, pro-social ecosystems that blend a hybrid of digital and in person that young men actually want to participate in. Because I think if we just have this bifurcated conversation about online versus offline, we're not really understanding the ways that sort of digital spaces and technologies are really integrated in our in-person lives as well. Like we'll see young men talking to each other in person and calling each other by their gamer tags or their gamer names. And so even our identities are shaped by our digital personas, right? And so this really requires a multi-layered response. Of course, governments have a role, including stronger regulation, transparency requirements for recommender systems, meaningful platform accountability, age-appropriate restrictions and protections, of course. But I also think that we have to move beyond the idea that, just government regulation and removing sort of access to platforms is going to be the solution here. As I mentioned, hybrid solutions that really respond to the interplay of online and offline lives that actually improve overall well-being. And so one of those things that we've been looking at is actually promising experimentation around community infrastructure through kind of digital community leaders. So we've been working on a project called Project Moonlight, where we work with moderators who are sort of the community architects of spaces like Discord. And so on Discord, we've been working with mods with community reach of over 22 million users across 9 different Discord servers. And the moderators are the ones who build the actual community infrastructure that facilitate belonging and onboarding into communities. They de-escalate conflict. They model behavior in these online communities. So instead of only focusing on content removal, we're investing in the human people behind the online systems that shape these communities. So some of the things we do are like coaching moderators, community health assessments, synchronous social events, offline our IRL events that we help them set up, evidence-based moderation tools that we're helping them to build that encourage healthier interaction on these platforms. And so, we have a lot of other solutions that we're working on, including work with content creators and creating cohorts of creators that are pushing alternative messages that do respond to those questions young men have. But ultimately, this is really about social infrastructure that makes care and belonging desirable and achievable. And of course, that includes, policy solutions, which happy to get into, but that's some food for thought of how we're thinking about actually how we move the conversation from just panic to thinking about what we do in action and the support that we can really provide for men and boys as they navigate this increasingly complicated world.
Thank you, Carolyn. That I do like the idea of a multi-layered and hybrid approach solution to. I think that's definitely a great solution and one that tackles both the online and offline. And as you're saying, given how interconnected they are, it's important. Mark, is there anything you'd like to add on this particular solution or any other solutions that have worked in your field?
Well, I've just been listening intensely to uh, to Caroline's been saying. I learned a huge amount. I mean, for somebody, I don't want to show my age here, but somebody who left college when email, mobile phones, and the internet hadn't been invented or even were available. So I'm always learning lots about this. But I want to just dwell on a few other issues because I don't want to obviously repeat the sage advice and words that came from Caroline, but some of the bigger picture issues as well is that what I think young men and boys need to hear from society and policymakers, but the communities is that we believe in them, we see them, we hear them, we're on their side. For far too long, too many young men and boys are feeling forgotten. They're feeling they're being spoken at. They're being told what they can't do rather than what they can do, and they're not being talked about as a positive force for good, not only for themselves and their friends and family, but obviously for women and girls as well. And we've got to get that overarching narrative right, because if the young men and boys are feeling disenfranchised from society and all the messaging they're getting, and there's been some difficult messaging that's been out there actually, aimed at young men and boys and telling them that they're worthless and stuff, online community groups, then actually that's going to drive some of that behavior and drive some of them into the arms of of of, uh, of the toxic influences and exploitation. So we've got to get the overriding societal narrative right. Other areas that we've been thinking about is the nuts and bolts issues. And what I mean by that is that we need to get young men and boys better educated. We need to make sure they have mentors. We need them to think that they will be able to get skills and get a job, uh, um, leave home, own their own home or rent up their own home, start a family, etc. The things that were seen as being easier 20, 30 years ago, their parents, and a lot of young men and boys don't think they're going to be better off than their parents. Um, so you've got all of those types of issues, and then you've got mental health issues, the boys and physical health, where they're coming forward to try and get help or they need help because and the safety net isn't there for them, and all of these other things combine to create the pathway into accessing misogynistic content and also disillusionment, disconnection, and all of these things that act against their masculinity. So, so we need two or three things happening. We need the cultural piece, the social piece, the online content piece, but also we need this bigger issue about just getting across to men and boys, young men and boys, that we're on their side and that we're here to help them, and they know who to speak to if they need to get help, i.e., speak to real life people, not toxic influencers, or try and get content that offers them a quick fix. So there's some of the bigger tectonic issues that we need to uh, talk about and think about, as well as the specifics as well.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Mark. Caroline, is there anything more you'd like to add in terms of changes that you'd like to see? I guess we talked about platforms. Mark, you talked about the cultural, the social aspect. Are there any other aspects that we might have missed?
Yeah, probably because there's a number of researchers who are part of this event. One barrier that we really face that I think we're starting to see some changes around is that we don't have enough evidence about what effective prevention looks like in online spaces at scale. Platforms are moving incredibly fast. while traditional research timelines often can be quite slow, as we know, for good reason in many cases, but also I do think we need to start broadening our imaginary of what research can look like and the pace at which we need to move. So one thing that we're investing in that I think will be really useful is sort of rapid test and learn approaches that allow researchers, practitioners, creators, so people who actually live and breathe and make content in these spaces, or again, or moderators, and platforms to sort of experiment responsibly and share findings openly. So I think that is something that we're really laser focused on investing in right now because, in a lot of conversations I'm in, it's like, oh, where's the evidence base behind this sort of digital intervention? And, if there's no evidence base, it's sort of a catch-22. When there's no evidence base, how do you actually put investment in trying to design a solution or an intervention? And so you just kind of go into this like cyclical sort of chicken or egg situation. And so I think we're just trying to respond with the times and rapidly test things and iterate and then move on when something doesn't work. And so I'd invite folks interested in that sort of pace and scale of thinking to reach out and happy to chat more about like what this could look like with a whole cohort of different types of actors involved in this type of research.
Thank you, Caroline. And Mark, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Um, no, because I'm just listening intently. I mean, it's completely right. I think this. I will add something now, though. It is just to add to that even that change is happening rapidly, and lots of legislators are really slow to catch up because of the process. So, as well as the research taking a lot of time, the policy response that often then comes after the research, you end up though in the 2 3 years behind the curve in terms of what's actually happening. And I think that needs to actually speed up the response. I mean, there's the endless debate we're seeing, everyone's looking intently about what's happening in Australia around the social media, discussions in other parts of the world as well about that form of regulation. Still an ongoing debate about actually whether the platforms are platforms or do we make the platforms a publisher? And that debate won't go away, and nor should it, because there will come to a point where actually a lot of countries and a lot of organisations will say, to the platforms, we're actually viewing you now as a publisher, and they'll change the law around that. So there's lots of things to play for. It's evolving. We need to be quicker at that. But there is always hope. There's always hope where everybody's in the right place now and everyone's looking for these positive solutions, which was not where we were at 5 10 years ago.
Great. Thank you both so much for sharing experiences, findings, and solutions from your work. What's coming through clearly is that there is no single solution here. There's quite a few. And, you've talked about a cultural and societal shift, a change, making sure that men and boys feel like they are part of it, feeling that they're not the problem, they are the solution, and knowing that they can help. There's also the need for more investment for men, for facilities, for support, for mental health, for men and boys, and making sure that they have those resources to be able to go to. And then there's also the idea of a hybrid sort of solution of including the online and the offline. If the online is the environment where men and boys are actively participating in it, let's make sure, and Caroline, as you were saying, let's make sure that we have a solution that includes that both the online and the offline component to make sure that we're not just taking content down, but we're actually addressing those root causes. As we start wrapping up, I want to end by looking forward as opposed to backward. And if we are having this conversation again in 5 years' time, what would you think success would look like for both of you? Mark, I'll start with you.
Oh,
It's a
thank you
difficult
very
question.
much. I think that what we would see is that the number of men and boys engaged in misogynistic content was a tiny, tiny minority, and that tiny, tiny minority were the problems that they were exhibiting were being addressed. So we've got to get the volume of men and boys who are engaging in this content down. Whether we'll ever eradicate it, not quite sure, because there will always be some young men and boys who are vulnerable to this. But let's get it down to small single figures. And then we can address those particular individuals because we know who they are and what support they need to make sure that they're not engaging in this content.
Thank you, Mark and Caroline.
Yeah, I think, as we've said many times, I think success in 5 years would look like a world where we've stopped treating online misogyny as simply a content moderation problem and really addressed it as a broader social, economic, and deeply relational issue. I'd hope we'd see platforms taking actual responsibility for the environments that they create, with transparency around algorithms, meaningful safety by design standards. And I'd even go to say that like by design, safety should be the floor. We should vision like care by design as the thing that we're actually pushing for, because we have to set our aspirations higher than just simply safety. That should be sort of the bare minimum of what our online spaces should actually resemble and provide. And so, you know, ultimately, I think this is also a conversation about expanding the story of what it means to be a man, and really seeing that as like something hopeful and positive to aspire to, rather than something that we are leading in a conversation around like shame or blame. And so, yeah, this to me is a conversation about creating the conditions where healthy relationships, healthy communities, healthier societies, and democracy are the things that we're working towards and aspiring to, not just sort of punitive or prevention or harm reduction conversations. And so I don't know, I get really excited when I think about the possibilities around designing for care and for like good relationships. And so I think if we can like move the needle in terms of like having that aspirational visionary thinking, I think it will bring more people into a conversation where, everyone's exhausted and tired and doesn't want to talk about all the like horrors of the world. And yeah, so if we can come together to vision forward of what that could look like, I think then we'd be in a really good place in 5 years.
I agree with absolutely everything there. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you both so much, Mark and Caroline, for this and for ending it in such a positive and hopeful manner. I hope this conversation has given everyone watching, whether you're working in policy, education, tech, or research, useful insights into both the challenges and the opportunities when it comes to engaging men and boys in preventing online misogyny. Big thank you as well to the To Know More for hosting this conversation as part of their global summit on TFGBV. And to all those watching, thank you for joining us.